Yeah, that's,
So you ready to leave it alone like that?
yeah, if it's recording, but, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll just play with the camera from now. I guess we can start now.
There you go. Everybody goes silent. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Placentia Bay Cultural Arts Centre on this beautiful, like a spring Saturday afternoon. It's great to see so many people here and some visitors from outside the area joining us as well as we continue with our Discover Placentia speaker series. Of course, many of you are familiar with our Discover Placentia series, created as a part of the 350th anniversary celebrations that we held in 2012 to celebrate the establishment of Placentia as the French capital way back when in 1662. Of course, it was a great year of celebrations, and we're getting ready now to bring things to a close. And this indeed is probably one of the last formal public events that will take place as a part of those celebrations. Before we get into today's session, I'd just like to personally take a moment as the chair of Placentia 350 to thank the Placentia Historical Society for putting together the Discover Placentia series. Tom, Lee, and all the crew with the Historical Society certainly put a great amount of work and effort into helping share the stories of Placentia with some really great speakers throughout the series, and it was certainly a great addition to telling the stories. That was our theme for the anniversary year, telling the stories in Placentia. It worked out really well with the presentations. And now I can see at the podium. Thank you, Tom. So we'll get right into this afternoon's presentations. We have two speakers here today, and the first one is Amanda Crompton, and she is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Archaeology at Moore University, and her research interests revolve around the historical archaeology of Newfoundland and Labrador. Her current research project examines the French colonial experience on the island of Newfoundland and the mainland of Labrador. The colonial experience was a varied one, influenced by local adaptations, individual histories and experiences, and local circumstances, as well as large socio-political structures, economic activities, and proximity to or distance from colonial administrations. Her research consists of a continued study of an official compact French colony right here in the community of Placentia, and exploration of unofficial or locally sanctioned settlements outside of Placentia in Placentia Bay, and of course the growth of the French Commission-based settlements along the Labrador side of the Strait of Belle Isle. She also has an interest in the larger connections that linked these communities with the outside world to markets elsewhere in the New World, as well as markets in European and southern locations. Her PhD research examined various archaeological sites from the French colony of Plaisance, and of course Plaisance was the only official French colony in Newfoundland occupied between 1662 and 1713. She spent 4 field seasons excavating the remains of the first fortification built by the French here, which remains virtually unknown from documentary resources. She is specifically interested in reconstructing the life history of the fort, understanding how the fort functioned within the larger landscape of the colony, and how the soldiers of the garrison were intertwined with the civilian population. She's also interested in how View Fort collections can reveal interactions with the outside world to identify the larger trade networks that supply the fort. So this afternoon, she will offer a presentation on the new archaeological and historical interpretations of the View Fort site right here on Mount Pleasant. And the new archaeological, historical, and categorical evidence allows a better understanding of View Fort's history and the lives of the soldiers who lived there, the relationship between the garrison and the wider community, and of course, the relationships with the Atlantic world in general. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Amanda Crompton.
want to say thank you for inviting me out to, thank you for inviting me out today to talk to you. It's been too long since I was in Placentia. I have some really fond memories of spending a lot of time here, and I've realized as I was sort of coming in and looking at all the familiar landmarks, how much I miss being here. Thank you also to the Historical Society for organizing this and for accommodating my awkward schedule. I tried to come out here in last October, but there was a scheduling conflict with a conference, and we tried to get me out here for a Thursday night, but I teach a late class, and so anyways, so I appreciate all their hard work in that, and thank you for showing up on an otherwise lovely Saturday where you could be out doing other things other than listening to me, so I really appreciate that. So today I'm going to take hopefully about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes if I get talky, and summarize some of the highlights of my doctoral research, which focus on the French colony here in Placentia. And, is there a remote control for that? We spent 4 years undertaking fieldwork on behalf of both the town of Placentia and the Placentia Area Historical Society. And I'm happy to know that the project that we started back in 2001 continues on, and has continued on with a variety of researchers since the demands of writing a thesis and teaching drove me back behind a computer. I don't need to tell anyone in this room what a great spot Placentia is, and nobody needed to tell the French either, because we know that they had been coming here on a really regular basis since the 16th century. And so by the middle of the 17th century, the French government kind of caught up with the idea that, in fact, Placentia was kind of an important place, and Newfoundland was important to them. And so they decided, French administrators decided to found an official colony in Newfoundland to protect the French fishery and to promote its growth. And so this brings us to the Great Beach in 1662 with the arrival of the first French colonizing venture. And so, as you know, Placentia remained French until 1713, when, under the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht, Plaisance, the colony of Plaisance, became the town of Placentia, and everything that was French became English. It's not hard to see why the French decided that they wanted to live here. The harbor itself, as you all know, has a lot of natural advantages. It's large, it's complex, it can hold a number of ships, it's sheltered, typically ice-free, although I've seen some pictures where there's a lot of ice in the harbor. And it had already been a really popular spot for those French seasonal fishing ships, and had been for a long time. As you know, most settlements, most of the early settlement in early Plaisance was located in and around those 3 beaches. They focused particularly on living on the cobblestone beaches. The dictates of the fishery in so many ways drove settlement, as it so often has in Newfoundland's history. The French liked drying their fish directly on cobblestone beaches where they could, and of course Placentia is blessed with a number of large cobblestone beaches and really perfect for fish. So on these beaches, the colonists, or habitants as they call themselves, built their homes and outbuildings and fish processing stations, which you can see here on this map. This is a map drawn up in 1699 by a French engineer. And it's always struck me as fascinating that the French actually chose to live directly on the cobblestone beaches. They divided them up, as you can see here, between themselves. And they were given land grants designating their ownerships, and they built their homes directly on these economic spaces. This map here shows their houses and their gardens. You can see the garden plots, the little dotted lines there. And of course they had to bring all of this soil in to sort of build these gardens, because it was just a beach, it was just a cobblestone beach. So living on the beaches caused them a lot of extra work. They didn't need to do this really. There was any number of well-sheltered, lovely spots to live in Placentia, and they could have reserved the beaches strictly for drying fish. But I think that they were, a key point that they were trying to reinforce here is that they owned this land. They owned it directly. They didn't have to pay rent to a lord. This is different. In Quebec, this would not have played out like this. In Quebec, we see the seigneurial system where a lord owns the land and everyone who lives on it has to pay him rent directly. But in Plaisance, that doesn't happen. So these habitants own their lands outright. And they also had to share the beach. They had to share the beach with seasonal fishermen who continued to come to Plaisance even after the founding of the colony and hang out here for the summer, processing their catch, and then return home again. So you have two different groups of people sharing this beach. And so I think one of the reasons that the habitants chose to live on the beach is it's a demonstration of the fact that this is my land and I own it, so therefore I'm going to live right on it. And you can see here that the French arranged their properties in long lots. They're all these long lots heading back from the water side. And this is really reminiscent of how the French arranged their properties elsewhere in New France, be it in Quebec or in Louisiana. We see this emphasis on very long, skinny lots that give onto a water source. Next time you're flying to Toronto, when you fly over to Quebec, look out the window and you can still see the remnants of this old settlement pattern. Interestingly enough, though, we don't see the same sort of property arrangement at English fishery sites in Newfoundland, be it at Ferryland or Cupid's, for example. And so I've always sort of been fascinated by the way that the French do things a little bit different than the English in Newfoundland. They're here for the same reason, to make a go of the fishery, but how they do it is always a little bit different. Plaisance had a garrison, too, from its very earliest days. And so fort construction was one of the earliest tasks that the colonial administration had. And so they selected the hillside here, that you know better as Mount Pleasant, for the construction of their first fort. Now, they don't name the fort. They don't give it a formal name. Unlike later forts in Placentia, which get proper names like Fort Louis or Fort Royal, this fort, for whatever reason, doesn't get a name. So the name that seems to have stuck is the Vieux Fort, or the Old Fort. And this is a name that gets given to the fort after it stops being used. And so for better or for worse, it's a name we're stuck with. Now, the Vieux Fort was an absolutely ideal place to do archaeology. It's the sort of thing that archaeologists dream of. Our project really wanted to take a closer look at the community's French history. And one of the advantages of this wonderful site, it lay in its location. Many of the original parts of the French settlement are now, of course, located underneath people's backyards today. And as archaeologists, we run into this all the time. A good place to live is a good place to live. And this is certainly true of Placentia. But the Vieux Fort offers something special. Located on that hillside, it wasn't in anyone's backyard, which means that I didn't have to trouble anyone by having a bunch of dirty, smelly archaeologists on their property, digging in and around the rose bushes. And to be honest, we did trouble more than a few of you to dig some holes in your gardens, and I want to thank everybody who let a crew of smelly archaeologists into their backyard. We did spend some time at other sites. But from the project's very earliest days, we knew that we wanted to spend a lot of time at the Vieux Fort. Even better for me, the hard work of actually finding the site had been already done by two then graduate students, Dr. Barry Belton, who's now a faculty member in the Department of Archaeology, and Matt Carter, had found the site in 1996. So really, the hard work for me was done. It was a no-brainer. The site's been found, it's up on a hill, there's nobody living there, I'm going to dig there. And so once we had relocated the site, we spent 4 field seasons excavating there. Another reason that I was really interested in digging here is that the site dates to the very earliest years of the colony's history. The site was occupied from 1662 up until about 1690. And this is the area, the time period, that we know the least about Plaisance's history. If we look at the documentary evidence alone, and here I've got on screen a search screen from the Library and Archives Canada, so it's main Canadian archives in Ottawa. And if you just Google, or if you just enter the word Plaisance in their search screen, it'll pull up about 3,000 documents, most of which will relate to this community, which is pretty good. But of those documents, maybe a third of them date to the period before 1690. It's just not as well documented. And a lot of those documents, which I've since taken a look at, are very short and very brief. They might name the colony in name only, and that's kind of about it. So what this means is the archaeology has the potential to fill in a lot of the blank areas that we don't know from the historic record. View Fort is important for another reason. And of course, this may change, but particularly as the archaeology of Placentia develops. But right now, it's the only site that was never reoccupied by the English. So many other sites were taken over by the English in 1713. They were altered, expanded, taken down, or otherwise changed. But the View Fort was left on a hillside. The worst thing that has happened to this site, I'm very proud to say, is that trees grew on it. So it's a perfect little window into what the colony was like before 1690. And this site is even more important when you consider it in the larger context of Newfoundland history. It is, in the history of Newfoundland, the very first full-blown, government-sponsored, large-scale artillery fortification built on the island. Now, you might think that the need to build a fortification to protect settlements goes hand-in-hand with colonization, but not really. We don't actually see fortifications built by the English in Newfoundland until the very, very end of the 17th century. So we have some very small-scale fortifications at English sites. So in Ferryland here, you can see everywhere that D is indicated on this map are small, little tiny batteries, so very small gun platforms. Oregon, a very small battery at the entrance to the Narrows and St. John's here. And it's not until really the very end of the 17th century that we start to see some effort at making larger fortifications. And even then, the very first big fort built in St. John's was not an initiative of the Royal Navy, but in fact was an initiative of local inhabitants who really wanted to protect themselves from the French in Placentia. And so the effort of construction was left entirely up to the civilians. So realistically, the View Fort is important because it's the first. It's the very first large-scale fortification constructed on the island. The emphasis placed on fortifying the colony is not surprising. From its very beginnings, Plaisance was what's called a colonie royale. It's a state-sponsored initiative from the very beginning, as opposed to the English efforts of settlement in Newfoundland, in which the state played a sort of not as prominent role. Additionally, the English placed greater emphasis on the Navy for the protection of their colonies, while the French were a firm believer in land-based fortifications. Now, the View Fort is a smallish fort, especially if you compare it with some of the larger French fortifications elsewhere in Quebec. But that makes it no less significant. In the context of Newfoundland, it's an important spot. So, I've been showing this map a lot, and the reason I keep showing the same map again and again and again is because it's the only good one we have. Again, returning to that problem of a poor documentary record. And it's not as detailed as we might like. And our excavations were able to demonstrate quite early on that this depiction of the fort is almost certainly very exaggerated. First of all, the fort does not take up half of the hillside like it's shown on this map. The map is not a complete fabrication. Whoever drew it had been to Placentia, had been to Plaisance. They drew the harbor really accurately, but they drew this very large, very impressive-looking fortification, and it probably wasn't quite that large and quite that impressive, particularly when it comes to the defenses of the fort. The defenses here circled in red. And one of the first things we wanted to do that very first year is to find out if we could find any remnants of the fort's fine defensive walls as shown on this map. So if this map is accurate, the front defenses of the fort, those that are circled, should be on the large terrace, right there, indicated by that shaded area, which gives the only good view of the harbor. And that's the view of a harbor on a very nice summer day. But we found absolutely no trace, no big stone walls, no rammed earthen platforms, no nothing. And indeed, and this always puzzled me, and it was about 5 years later, I was working my way through some old documents that were It was a letter that some of the habitants of Plaisance had written to French administrators back home, and they were complaining about the governor, who they hated. And what they complained about, one of their complaints, was that he made them donate a bunch of wood so that they could fix the palisades of the new fort. And of course, palisades meaning a wooden wall. So what I think is that these fine defenses that you see on that Vieux Fort map were never built. It was a simple wooden palisade that protected the fort. With that being said, they did spend some time building some structures inside the fort. And the French, in fact, seem to have expended considerable energy on the fort's interior, constructing at least 3 buildings. We selected one for full-scale excavation over four seasons, and here you can see a map showing the full extent of our excavations. Berkeley, that was that big map that I spent, I don't know, the last summer drawing all season long. That's what it looks like when it's all cleaned up. So, we spent a lot of time working at this building, and we quickly realized from the personal artifacts that we were finding and the 2 hearths that this was, in fact, a place where people lived. This was a barracks building. Here's one of the hearths here that we found in the very last season. The fort is in really good shape. It really hasn't been disturbed in any great way, which is fantastic. Some of the stonework is really well preserved. There we go, there's just an example. In some cases preserved over 1 meter in height, which is remarkable, really. The stone is almost certainly locally quarried. I know some stone gets imported into, some French stone is imported from France to Plaisance later on, after the 1690s, but I'm pretty sure that all of this is local, and I'm pretty sure I know exactly where it came from. About a 10-minute walk from the site, there's a big old cliff face with big boulders at the bottom, and I'm pretty sure they were just quarrying it locally. All the artifacts that we found from this building are consistent with what we know historically of the fort's occupation. So they all date to between 1660 and 1690. What you see on the screen here are clay tobacco pipes. Clay pipes are really important, particularly the bowls. These are the bowls of the pipes. They're super important to archaeologists like me because they were widely used. Smoking was as bad a habit 300 years ago as it is today, and they were fragile, so they broke easily. And they were also inexpensive, so if you broke it, you could, it was reasonably easy to buy another one, which means that they litter archaeological sites. They are the cigarette butts of their day. And the great thing for us is that the bowls themselves change through time. Their style and their size change through time, and we can date them to very tight windows. So I'll just show you an image. Here are some of this is the change of pipe bowl forms between about 1580 to about 1820. And you can see they change quite regularly through time, which means we can then use these artifacts to date our sites. So I can tell you with every confidence that the Vieux Fort was really only occupied up until the 1690s. And we know from the historic record that the fort was destroyed violently in 1690. On February 25th, 45 English attackers invaded Plaisance. They probably landed somewhere around Point Verde and walked to the colony in the night. They surprised everyone. Nobody knew they were coming. The phrase is they were all surprised in their beds. They attacked the colony and took control of it, imprisoned everyone in the church, and systematically looted the colony for 6 weeks. The historical record doesn't document precisely what the English did at the Vieux Fort, but it seems really unlikely that they would have left it unscathed. We know they were at the fort. They were said to have spiked 4 cannon and thrown 4 more into the water somewhere. And in fact, our excavation of the barracks tells us that this is exactly what happened. Part of the site, we found layers of very thick charcoal, just a layer of burn that runs right up to the insides of the wall of the barracks. Suggesting that probably the roof had burned. It's full of nails too, so I think the roof had burned. But the walls were still standing high enough to contain this layer of burn, suggesting that it's not just an artifact of the building slowly being abandoned over time. The walls were still standing when the roof went down. And then above that, we find a layer of just solid rubble where clearly at some point the chimney stack had fallen down. One of the chimney stacks had fallen down. So again, this is a very clear destruction, I think, of the barracks. And I would be surprised if the English left the fort unscathed during their 6-week stay in the colony. And the great thing is for modern-day archaeologists is that the Vieux Fort site remained largely unoccupied after that. But one of the things I wanted to do was figure out more than just what happened to the fort and the buildings in it. I wanted to get a handle on what life was like for the soldiers who lived there. For most of the fort's history, we don't even know who they were. We don't know their names. We know some of the officers. We know that the very last officer who ran the fort was Louis de Costebelle. And he was the brother, in fact, of a gentleman who would later become the colony's governor, Philippe Pasteur de Costebelle. I know that in the 1680s there was a master cannoneer and armorer living at the Vieux Fort, and he was named Abraham. That's all I know. I think that was his last name. I'm assuming. But of the individual soldiers, I knew literally nothing until I found one document. This is only part of it. But it is a list of soldiers, a list of names of soldiers who were sent to Placentia in 1687. And for the first time, I actually had some names. I don't know their ages. I don't know where they came from. But I know that they were, so what we have here is a list of their names. Beside that is a list of the things that they were given in order to sign up for basically for the name. And so they were paid, in most cases they were given habit complet, which is basically a suit of clothes, and sometimes a little bit of money, just to sort of secure their entrance into the military. Realistically though, they weren't given an awful lot. The soldiers were amongst the poorest members of this colony. They were very poorly paid. But this is one of my big accomplishments, was at least to be able to put some names to the poor soldiers who had lived and worked at the Vieux Fort. But I also wanted to understand what they got up to. What was their day like? What did they do when they were living in the barracks? So I turned to the artifacts that we found from the site. These smashed bits of pottery and glass may not look like much, but this is what I consider to be archaeological treasure. I don't think I've ever found anything worth a lot of money on the open market. Though, you know, if you watch the Discovery Channel, you'll see shows about archaeologists finding gold and treasure, and that never happens. If it did, I'd be driving a much better car. I'm kidding, obviously. I'm really kidding. We generally find things that are bits of pottery and glass that have been broken up and left behind. Most times people took their valuables with them when they left a site. So based on so I started to take a closer look at the broken and smashed up bits of pottery that we found, and I started to look at them by category to see what they could tell me. And so at the barracks, we know that the full range of sort of human activities were taking place at the fort. People were preparing food in the barracks. They were storing some food in the barracks in a small way. They were certainly drinking in the barracks. They were eating, as well as a few vessels related to personal hygiene in there as well. What's interesting, though, is the most important thing that they seem to have been doing there, at least based on the percentages of food, is you see the highest percentage of functional category there is for beverage service. They're soldiers, they're unattached men, they're young men living together, far away from home and family. And so the thing that took up most of their time at the Vieux Fort was drinking. We know that this is not surprising. Alcohol was used as a means of fostering sociability and esprit de corps. It was encouraged for soldiers to drink. It was thought to be a bonding exercise. It was good to encourage them to be brave. It was also perceived to be to have medicinal uses. Drinking alcohol was a way to keep warm. The climate was cold and clammy, but alcohol was perceived to be a warming thing to do. Additionally, the soldiers almost certainly would have been customers in civilian-run cabarets or taverns, effectively, that would have been located somewhere here on the Great Beach. And they sold alcohol by the pint. Officers too got into this and would actually sell their employees effectively alcohol. Much in the same way as alcohol, tobacco was also important for social bonding. So here are some more of those tobacco pipes. Again, tobacco smoking was seen as a healthful warming activity in a damp and cold climate. Tobacco and tobacco pipes were reasonably inexpensive, meaning that soldiers could afford them despite being very, very poorly paid. Several of the pipe stems you'll see here, so these are the stems of the tobacco pipes, and you can see how they're sort of narrow at one end. It's because they've been whittled. If the stem broke, the pipe stems themselves could be whittled to fit into a replacement stem made of wood. Some of these, and I'll just indicate, it's the one at E, marked E up there on that slide. You can see right at the top of it, there's a little groove at the top. Those are the marks from somebody's teeth, as he just used it repeatedly and held it between his teeth. So they tell their own. Each pipe tells its own little story. And you can see with the image at the far right-hand side of the screen, it's the bottom of a tobacco pipe, and it's been marked with an X. And that's probably the mark that somebody made on it to indicate that it belonged to him. I would expect that most of the soldiers wouldn't have been able to read or write. So it's one way of making your mark and claiming something as your own. Other artifacts from the fort are equally as instructive. Not surprisingly, we found an awful lot of firearms-related artifacts like gun flints and shot. These are gun flints that you see here. This suggests that each soldier kept his own personal supply of both gun flints and shots, and probably a weapon with him at the barracks. Soldiers would have been encouraged to use their firearms for hunting as well as for soldiering. Soldiers were purposefully only issued rations for 4 days a week. That's all the food you got. The rest of the days of the week, you were expected to find your own. So they were encouraged to hunt and fend for themselves for the rest of their dietary needs. So what a great life to be a soldier. Another thing that I started thinking about as I was in the process of writing all this up is to think about what it meant that the barracks were built of stone. This is a large stone building. It's about 27 meters long by about 7 meters wide. And the use of stone in construction of the barracks, and the fact that there is a barracks at all, is actually kind of intriguing, especially when we consider that the effort of stone construction wasn't put towards the fort's defenses. All of the time and effort and the knowledge it would have taken to build a stone building was put into the barracks rather than the defenses. And I started thinking, why is that so? You would think you would want the strongest part of your fort to be the defenses. Instead, they were happy to live with a simple wooden palisade. I think part of the reason is the fort is located about 30-odd meters above sea level, so they had the advantage of height. So that's kind of a natural defense. But also, I think that perhaps they were trying to make a nice place for the soldiers to live. Undoubtedly, the soldiers built this themselves. They were probably directed by a mason. But I think the administration of the day wanted to provide the soldiers with comfortable housing because soldiers were also dangerous. Soldiers were a bunch of unattached young men with no ties to the community, were poorly paid, and generally disregarded. They were often feared because soldiers could be a source of revolt and discontent in the community. And in fact, the soldiers did revolt in Placentia. That first winter in 1662, they revolted disastrously, killing the governor and the chaplain and a few other key members of the local administration. So it had gone badly wrong. The soldiers had been unhappy. One of the first things they did after when they started to mutiny was to open up the storehouses and eat and drank, and they ate and drank. They must have been hungry and thirsty and just angry generally. So perhaps one of the reasons that the barracks building was constructed was a way to say, well, we can't give you much money, but at least you got a roof that doesn't leak and a couple of fireplaces to keep you warm. Barracks buildings, in fact, are really unusual at this time. Barracks are for the specific buildings built constructed to house soldiers are rare, really, before the middle of the 18th century. So it's a very early forecast of the notion that we should build a separate house for soldiers. So I think that that first disastrous winter with the big soldiers mutiny in Placentia was not forgotten. And I think that's why we see this building constructed. Now, what's clear though is despite having built this very large building to house the soldiers, they didn't always live there. one of the important things that I wanted to look at was what was the relationships between the soldiers who lived at the site and the rest of the community. We might think that the barracks would serve to isolate the soldiers and keep them at the fort, but this was in fact not the case. The fort and the soldiers who lived there must be considered within the larger context of the colony. So, what I discovered is that soldiers were in fact expected to work off of site. Their pay was poor, it came once a year, they weren't given enough food to last them a week, so they were expected to find employment. And one of the ways that they did this, obviously, as being prisoners, is they hired themselves out as fishermen. So soldiers were fishermen, in addition to soldiering, they were fishermen too. This is why, when we were digging away the Vieux Fort barracks, we would find fish hooks, because the soldiers were expected to work. So they probably worked as members of small fishing crews. And they were probably provided with food and utensils and some form of compensation for their labor. So at least they had a way, the soldiers had a way, at least, of making their financial lot in life not as bad as it could have been. It was one way that they could work for themselves to try to improve their situation. The Vieux Fort, though, was the only fort in Plaisance for 28 years, until its destruction in 1690. And it was never rebuilt. So this is the only fort located right there with the little red square until 1690. And it was never rebuilt. All subsequent fortifications were built somewhere else in the colony. And one of the things I wanted to answer was why? Why was this so? Unfortunately, the documentary record is entirely mute on the subject. It doesn't tell us. There's a letter written in 1690 or 1691 that says, we're not going back to that site. It didn't work out very well. We're not going back there. So I kind of have to guess. But what is clear, what is very clear, is that the French never really intended to reoccupy that hillside in any substantial way after the mid-1690s. Because this is where all the fortifications occur after 1690. They multiply in number. This larger system of fortification required a much larger investment in the colony than had ever transpired before. Not only were the fortifications built on a larger scale, remember, they required a larger workforce. They required more supplies. And they were garrisoned by a much larger contingent, where the Vieux Fort had maybe 25 soldiers on a good day, if they were all at the fort that day. We know that later on, after 1690, the garrison grows to a number maybe 300 individuals. And so I've thought a lot about why this is so, why the Vieux Fort was never reoccupied. It's a good enough site. It's up on a nice big hill that provides you with some sort of natural defenses. And I think that what the French learned in 1690 after their colony, after they almost lost their colony, is that the Vieux Fort could not defend the harbor. And if you're going to defend the colony, you had to defend the length and breadth of the harbor. And so I started thinking about the master cannoneer named Abraham, who had lived at the Vieux Fort sometime in the 1680s. And I started thinking about his cannon and how far his cannon could have shot a cannonball. It's really difficult to speak with any confidence about the range of a cannon from this time period. You need to know how big the cannon is, how good the powder is. But most French artillery experts remained insistent until about the mid-18th century that the effective range of a cannon was limited to about 500 toises, what they call the toises, which is about 1,000 yards. So, if 1,000 yards is considered to be a rough estimate of a cannon's effective range, and especially considering the Vieux Fort probably only ever had small caliber cannon, then the territory that the Vieux Fort's cannon could cover can be estimated. And effectively, I think the Vieux Fort's cannon could have covered the Great Beach and the Gut. That's about it. And that's not good enough. And an engineer working in Plaisance noted this same problem. He was wondering about whether or not he should send soldiers and send lots of cannon to the Gallardine, to the battery beside Castle Hill. And he notes in a letter that The cannon located at this distance could not prevent ships from ships from entering Plaisance harbor because they were located too far away to be effective. And I think this is part of the viewfort's problem. So once we see fortifications spread up the north side of the harbor, we see a much greater offensive footprint. The cannon could cover the breadth and width of the harbor and effectively defend it. And I think it works because Placentia never falls to a cannon. Placentia falls to the stroke of a pen with the Treaty of Utrecht, but they're never taken by force after this time period. We also have to think about how the vieux fort would have looked in the landscape. Fortifications are supposed to be big, imposing symbols of power. They are supposed to represent an architectural statement that prevents anyone from attacking a colony. They are supposed to look terrifying, and I don't think the vieux fort did. And here I take some inspiration from a map drawn by Christian Lilly, who was an engineer on a ship commanded by Francis Wheeler, who pulled into the harbor in 1693. And the English sent a fleet to try to invade Plaisance in 1693, and they never did. They sat in the harbor for about a week. I've read the Lilly journal, and he talks about how they keep having councils of war and trying to figure out if they can actually attack Plaisance, and they give up before they're shot. And so I've taken a look at the map he's drawn of Placentia's harbor, and here I have to give some credit to the then president of the Historical Society, Ken Flynn, because we sat down together and we looked at this map, and undoubtedly we sat down together over a beer, because that's where all of our best ideas come from as archaeologists on one beer glass. And looking at this map and scratching our heads and thinking, it's a really weird map. As you can see, it shows the main part of the harbor, it shows the gut, it shows the northeast arm, but it doesn't show the Orcan River, it doesn't show the southeast arm, it doesn't show any of that. Why is that? And Christian Lilly was an engineer. He should have been able to make a better map than that. And I think the problem is, Christian Lilly is sitting rather, on a ship at the entrance to the harbor. They're hunkered down somewhere near Point Verde, obviously away from the rocks, but they're somewhere down there. And he couldn't see the far end of the harbor. Now, it's not surprising he doesn't show the vieux fort on this map. He doesn't. Of course, the vieux fort by 1693 has been abandoned. But what it shows you is the distance of how far away it would have been from somebody sitting down in a boat at the end of the harbor, and how far away the vieux fort site would have been. So this was a small fort defended by a wooden palisade, didn't look very imposing, and it was a long way away from the entrance to the harbor. So I don't think this is a very visible symbol of the might of the French crown. So the fort doesn't look good either. It didn't work well, it was too far back in the harbor, and it didn't look imposing. And finally, I think one of the final reasons that the French never rebuilt the fort is that it didn't work. The colony came in 1690, as close as they ever came to losing it. It would have been a disastrous year for everyone who lived here. So why rebuild a symbol of your failure? I think so. They pretty well completely abandoned the site. But one of the last things I wanted to take a look at was the relationship between the fort and the colony and the larger Atlantic world. Because Plaisance doesn't exist in a vacuum. And the people who lived here, including the soldiers, had friends, family, relatives back home in France. They would have had friends, family, and relatives in Quebec, and connections elsewhere as well. And I was lucky in that I stumbled upon a little-known documentary series that hasn't yet been studied in any great detail, and I will be spending some time this summer focusing just on this documentary series in order to publish something about it, because it contains an awful lot of information about French Placentia and French Newfoundland that nobody's ever seen before. I'm going to stumble across it just by luck. These are a series of documents written by a French trader who was active and living in Placentia in the summers in the 1670s. His name was Henri Brunet, and the series of documents consists of some letters. So here's the reference to where the series is. Here's one of the letters. You can see it was written at Plaisance in the 15th of September, 1675, and he's writing a letter to his friends and associates back in France. It also contains financial accounts. So here are some of the planters, some of the habitants who lived in Plaisance, and here's what they owe this particular trader. And most importantly, consists of 3 journals written in 1672, 73, and 74 that detail his trip from France to Placentia in a day-by-day format. So I know exactly how long the journey took him. I know what he did when he got here, who he talked to, who he had dinner with, who he got drunk with, why he was hungover the next day. I know how much fish he bought, the supplies he brought out. I know everything about this guy. And I know that after 1674, he actually continued in the Plaisance trade, but rather than going back to France every year, he moved to Boston, of all places. Boston had a small expat French community, and he continued his Placentia trade from Boston. So I'm going to Rhode Island this summer to spend a little time in the archives down there to see if I can ferret out any more information about this little known France trader. But one thing that his records emphasize that is during this early period, the trade between people was based on this, was based on face-to-face relationships. It's not just a sort of a coercive relationship between merchant and habitant. These people were financially entangled, and if one habitant had a bad fishing season, the merchant suffered too. So these people were in some ways his friends. So what these tell me are some valuable contextual information about who was active in the trade to Plaisance and the way that the trade was conducted in the colony. And what I tried to do is then link these papers with the archaeology, back to the archaeology. And archaeologists working on English Newfoundland sites have found that taking a look at where the pottery originates from, where the pottery was made, will tell us a lot about trade links. And so one of the things I tried to untangle is where exactly all these bits of broken pottery I found, where they came from in France. And I've been able to identify some of their origins. And I'll just show you where it all came from in a table. These are the different regions in France that the pottery was produced in. You can see that pottery is almost exclusively French in origin. It's dominated by this pottery from this port, a place called Saintonge. And this is not surprising. The Saintonge potteries are found widely on French sites across the world. And they strongly implicate the ports of Bordeaux, La Rochelle, and Rochefort in the Placentia trade in this early period. And this is not surprising. Henri Brunet, the merchant, he's from La Rochelle. And he returns there, as long as he's living in France, he returns there every year. Many of Plaisance's habitants are from this part of France. So this dominance of this pottery speaks to the very close relationships between habitants and merchants in this part of the world with southwestern France. Another interesting discovery is some pottery from kilns in Brittany. This is Breton pottery. This is a type of pottery first identified by Peter Pope, who I believe has come and given a lecture as well. And he was the first person to really draw our attention to this very interesting pottery. And not surprisingly, in trolling through the Brunet papers, I found several references to ships from Brittany plying their trade in and out of Plaisance's harbor. I also then thought I should take a look at how the Vieux-Fort assemblage or collection of artifacts compares to another really well-excavated fort at Castle Hill, which of course, as you all know, was excavated entirely in the 1960s, and a fantastic job was done. And so I visited where the collections are stored in Halifax and started to take a look at where their ceramics were coming from. And I found that things were different. So Castle Hill dating to after the 1690 period. I see that the majority of their pottery comes from Iberian sources, comes from Portugal and Spain. And that Saintonge type wares have fallen dramatically. We know from historic documents that after 1690, French administrators start to contract the supply of Plaisance, the official resupply of Plaisance, out to a series of merchants, some of whom are genuine Basques. So perhaps, and this is perhaps why we're seeing this influence of pottery from southern markets, perhaps this reflects the increasing Basque interest in the Plaisance trade. Throughout my sort of study of the site and the collection, I found that Plaisance was not actually a small backwater in a very remote area, but was in fact really well connected to the outside world. This was a French world, though. One thing that we don't see at Plaisance is any contact, or very little contact, at least in the archaeology, between the English and French. We know that there was a certain degree of contact between the English and French. There were a number of Englishmen who lived as naturalized Frenchmen here, who had taken French wives, and they effectively were treated as Frenchmen. But in terms of the trade contacts, the English and the French didn't get on that well in Newfoundland, and so their contact it seems very minimal. This is not to say that it can't happen. In Acadia, for example, the English and French trade with each other quite regularly. In French Louisiana, the French there are trading quite happily with the Spanish, who again they don't get along with generally. So this is a very specific and interesting situation in Newfoundland. Which means that for the people who lived here until 1713, Plaisance was a very, very French colony, and one that was very well entrenched in a wider French cultural, economic, and political world. And just in thinking about larger connections and a wider world, I started thinking about how this research came to be and all the people that helped me along the way. No archaeologist ever works in a vacuum. And so I just want to end by thanking an awful lot of people who have helped get me here along the way, both in terms of funding, and I've been very lucky to receive funding from a number of different sources, but people are just as important as money. And the assistance of many people, some of whom are in this room, I want to extend my deepest gratitude towards. And finally, I just want to end by saying that an archaeology project does nothing without muscle. And I had the good fortune to have a crew of about 40 individuals over the years, and who worked with us through an awful lot of difficult and hard work. And I want to extend a special and heartfelt thanks to each and every person who helped us out. And that's about all I have to say for today. So if there are any questions now or later, or
Check the question.
Any questions before we?
Hi, my name is Gary Brown. I'm a police and military historian and an author. And I was wondering how big of the habitat, the numbers have been on the beach area, and was there any, did you come up with anything showing a civilian gendarmerie or police or of that type?
It's a really good question, because we know, of course, in Quebec that there was a militia, a civilian-raised militia, and as I found very little evidence of it here. Really, I think the population, if we include all that, there's 1 year where I can answer that question of how big the population was, because we don't have the church records, they haven't survived, so it's hard for us to estimate. But I had 1 year in 1704 where I had enough census records and records of soldiers to be able to say that in the summertime, between the people who lived here, the soldiers and the seasonal fishermen, there would have been close to 2,000 people living in this harbor. It's pretty substantial. But I don't have any evidence of sort of formally organized militia. Now, there were about 300 soldiers, give or take, sometimes even more. The year in 1696 to 1697, there was an influx of another 150 on top of that. So I think it was reasonably well protected, actually, given the size of the population.
English Trailer section took river reading something years ago. The English sections from the main course and now they come by, especially here in the days of how many crossing.
Yes, I did. That's a good question, sir. The Burnett papers are just gripping reading as far as that goes. And he notes in 1672 and 73, as he's coasting into Placentia Bay, he writes, if he happens to see a ship, he writes it down. He said, I saw 2 ships from Boston, basically applying the waters of Placentia Bay, and they're selling tobacco. That's their big cargo. So yeah, I don't think it was a huge part of the trade, because these were reasonably unfriendly waters for the English, but a few brave souls managed to sneak in.
curious to know, certainly there was saying with regard to, I guess, occupation prior to, I suppose, and whether you found anything about I guess, whether who did that or
we know that there were seasonal fishermen. There are references to, just very scattered references in the documentary record to both French and Basque seasonal fishermen fishing out of Placentia's harbor. So, you might see reference to 60 ships, Basque ships in Placentia's harbor in the 1590s, something like that. But they're very scattered. The only evidence I ever found of anything at the view fort that was older than the fort, I found it, and this is again an archaeological curse. You always find the most interesting thing in the last week you're digging. Always, it never fails. And so we were just finishing up excavations at one end of the building, and we just dug down a little further, and darned if we didn't find the remnants of what had been a destroyed structure underneath, probably a hearth. And I started thinking, well, what on earth is it's not part of the barracks. It's definitely older than the barracks. And so I started looking through the historic record and realized that, in fact, the view fort hadn't been built on a blank slate. There had been some very small structure built there by those seasonal fishermen some years before. And they probably just took it over, knocked it down, and built their proper fort on top of it. But the references we see within the documentary literature and the archaeological evidence of that is really, really sketchy. And sadly, I would have loved to learn more about it, but you can only get what you're given in the documents and the archaeology, and sadly, that's not the option. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Very interesting indeed. Certainly presentations by Amanda, and we've had Steve Mills and others here, certainly give you a good appreciation of the importance that archaeology and history within Placentia. Indeed, something that we're proud to be able to showcase. I know for me it was further reinforced when I visited the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. And you walk in there and you actually see a full small section depicting the French connections, and what's there? Only a selection of artifacts from View Fort. So it's very interesting to see that there when I visited View some time ago. And certainly the town has been proud to support and in recent times fully fund the Placentia Uncover program. And while financial restraint within the budget and the lack of, or I should say virtually non-existent support for operation from the federal and provincial governments leave us in a level of uncertainty right now for the future of the program. We certainly look forward to the opportunity to continue uncovering the rich history of our settlement. So hopefully that will come to light. Right now we are going to take a short pause. There's some refreshments at the back of the room. We invite you to go back and avail of that. Then we'll come back, I guess, in 10 minutes or so, and we're going to explore another connection to Placentia. We're going to have a look at our Irish connections. So feel free to go back and enjoy the refreshments at the back of the room, and we'll come back shortly with our next speaker.